made it this far, it's at this point in the semester where we bring up a new rhetorical mode, and it's really a word that you've heard before, argument. There's nothing new about the word itself, though if it meant for you arguments that you have watched in the past, perhaps it's mom or dad and they're duking it out verbally in the kitchen over money or something really anger-inducing, something that makes people feel pretty tense, even irate, then that's something I need to redefine for you, because argument itself has a very innocent background. It doesn't necessarily mean the arguments that you've seen in the past. It can be as simple as an argument that you made to yourself to get up this morning and to come to class, or to click on this video so that you learn more about argument. Argument is something that all of your discipline field classes, all of the future professions that you go in have emphasized is important for students to practice and to improve upon. And usually all of us will admit that we can improve upon how we express something that's meant to, as it says here, to clear up, to prove, or even to emphasize the process of reasoning. All of those things we can work on. It doesn't just necessarily mean the arguments as we've traditionally or conventionally defined it through arguments that we've watched. It is a rhetorical mode. It's a genre of writing, which we talked about in the context of the syllabus. Argument can use inductive and deductive logic. Now we get into a little bit of the technical stuff. And of course our readings will cover this, but also our discussion in class will make mention of it. Why is that important? I think because we want to fine-tune and to take a close look at how the logic works in any argument. You remember inductive because that goes back to Samuel Scudder in class. That's where you take the facts of existence, fact, 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 and you piece them together to form a conclusion. You look at the fish, you look at the fins of the fish, you look at the teeth of the fish, and then you draw some conclusions about those facts that you articulate. That harkens back to the very beginning of class, of course, and to other things that we've taken a look at this semester, including facts and inferences. Deductive arguments are a little bit different because they depend on that first major premise, and that's how they're different. They don't start with a fact itself. They start with something abstract, something that's usually intangible, a definition. It could be even a prayer or belief, an assumption that's firmly held and maybe not noticed, usually an unconscious assumption, sometimes warranted, sometimes not. It begins with that premise and then proceeds through minor premises to a conclusion. Now we'll talk about deductive arguments soon enough. We're not there yet. Just pause here for a second because the main focus of what we're working on right now is that inductive argument and the logic that attends inductive reasoning. Why is that important? I suppose so we can focus on individual parts and not have all of this stuff shoved at us at once and overwhelm us. Okay, so argument. We're into the next rhetorical mode. We're pursuing inductive logic. Try and understand what it means. We've really been studying inductive logic since Samuel Scudder and even before that, of course. How do you study this business? Because we're into another word, fallacies, which are the errors in logic, the shortcuts in logic. And the explanation here that I've offered on this slide is meant to help us for the long term in looking at the next couple of weeks of class and the concepts that are part of it. First of all, don't depend on looking things up in a book and just using that as a reference point. The book or the readings that I give you are meant to help, yes. In fact, any of the words that we pursue and the concepts that we investigate can be found in any good collegiate dictionary. But to just do that is not enough. As I say here, it's less than the least that you can do. You really need to get involved with the concepts and be able to apply them. Otherwise, they won't stick. I know from experience that you have to be very active when learning the next couple of weeks. Otherwise, the material itself will seem very abstract, maybe distant from your own experience, whereas it really underlies most of what we do most every day. So, okay. I know that's a stretch for some students, but I'd like you to think about ways that you can be active in looking at concepts and trying to understand them. You want to look at each example that we offer in our readings and in class. Whenever possible, apply your thinking. Maybe even create your own example. Do writing to help support your learning. That means take notes. Very old-fashioned, but of course the writing firms up the knowledge that we get through our reading, through the videos, through our understanding. Take notes to yourself to help support and help define in our heads what it is that we're picking up through these concepts and looking at these readings and concepts. And when you write about these chapters or the readings that we take a look at, try to organize the new vocabulary, definitions, or concepts so you can relate them one to another. I'm going to show ways of doing that, and I'll suggest things that have worked for students in the past. But don't wait for me. The point is that you're taking an active learning role in the class, and that you're connecting yourself and your experiences to the ideas, the concepts that are presented in class. There is an exam coming up, and maybe that's where the rubber really hits the road. It's meant to help motivate us. Of course, it's meant to assess what you've learned out of the next coming weeks. We're headed to an exam, and I need to say that in advance so that people are ready for what is coming. I'll ask you questions about applying the concepts from the readings that we have and the concepts that are talked about in class, and also about a topic that you're researching, so it'll really be about both. And I'll explain more about that in class, of course. But let's deal with this first word. Fallacies are the name of the game for the next week anyway. We take a look at fallacies and their opposite. Take a look at the shortcuts in reasoning and at good reasoning. Because we define good logic by also taking a look at its opposite. That seems to make sense. If you look up any definition, or if you remember back to when we talked about definitions of words, oftentimes you get a definition of something by an explanation that talks about the opposite of the thing being defined, and that's meant to help us understand especially conceptual issues when we're trying to define something that is not the case by something that is the case. So that's step number one. That's one reason why we take a look at these fallacies and why we spend time on memorizing them or understanding them at all. They really show us the borders or limits with which we accept certain kinds of writing. You also need to memorize the most common fallacies, their names and definitions. It's not too much to ask. Everyone usually has to do this during their first year of college. And that's kind of important because the errors kind of fall into certain classes of error, certain kinds of error, right, that people have fallen prone to over the years, and the descriptions do matter, I think. You will need to be able to apply the terms accurately. So we're really picking up new vocabulary, if you want to think about it that way. And the point is not just to learn the definitions of the terms, but to be able to apply them. Let's get into the larger reason for why we're doing this. As in the case before, we have a name for something, and when we have a name for something, we're better able to describe it. That makes sense. I think I'll get no one who disagrees with that. Having the vocabulary for something allows us to describe it in a more apt or more precise way. And of course, we're always searching for that. We want to be able to have the language at our disposal to describe what it is that we're seeing, hearing, smelling, all of the rest of it. And of course, picking up the vocabulary in your profession is key. But here's the next step. If we have the name for something, we're actually more likely to recognize and see it. Oh, okay, what does that mean? That means that the concepts actually matter. Just as before when we took a look at words and their consequences early on in the semester, having the vocabulary for something, such as when we're doing the observation unit and I'm having you describe things, and sometimes you know the language for things, sometimes you're making approximations with the language to try and describe what it is that you're seeing, though you may not have the exact name, the exact specific name for what it is that you see. Well, it's no different here. Even though we're dealing in the realm of concepts, when you have the name for the fallacy, you're actually more likely to recognize that fallacy, which is why we spend some time on it. Remember back to the beginning, or remember the pictures we might have shown in class of the Game Boy. If you know the word for that, you're more likely actually not only be able to describe it, but recognize it, or certain kinds of cars, or even your teachers. You can walk down the center of campus, I just know from experience, and people will say hi, or they won't. They'll avert their eyes, or they'll notice you and give you a little smile and say, hey, howdy. If you know the name for something, even your professor, you're actually more likely to notice it and to be able to describe it. That's Collins walking down that mall there. I know him. Hello, how are you? So it is true for such issues as conclusions, reasons, report, argument, and we should add to that list fallacies. When we have the words for something, we're more likely to actually be able to notice, see, and describe it. One last word, too, about essay exams. We give essay exams on purpose at this point in the semester so that I can really help you in finals. It doesn't serve our purposes to try and give an exam at final time as everyone else is taking finals. I'm not trying to get out of something, but if this is a class that's trying to help with other classes, the best way we can really help that is to help students get prepared for writing, especially, but also just finals more generally, and what they'll tend to see in those final exam situations. Impromptu writing situations aren't going away either, and you'll have to write on the spot more frequently than you'd care to imagine. And that's not an unnecessary skill. It's something that's worth your time, and to practice with it will really help, as I say in my little slide here. There are strategies for approaching fast writing assignments. You don't have to approach them with a winging it approach. That's where my students sometimes will go into a final exam or into a situation where they have to perform in class, they have to demonstrate their knowledge. And instead of just going in, well, I just think I'll wing it and do the best I can and voila, and we'll see how it goes. Instead of that approach, which is less successful, what if we were to just give you some common sense guidelines, some suggestions from years of experience, both from me and from other professors and students alike, as to what has helped them in those situations where you have to demonstrate your knowledge very quickly. Why essay exams my students tend to do better. That's kind of odd. I don't quite understand that, but I think in this particular situation where you're asked to think on the spot, they do better, my students. If you think about it, that's kind of an odd thing to notice. I think it's because they don't have time to shilly-shally or waste time. They have to cut right to the core. They have to get right to the nut or the kernel, or if you like, the essential matter of what it is they're trying to communicate. And so that is worth practicing too, because trying to delay or coming up with an impromptu writing situation and then saying afterwards, well, I didn't get to the basic stuff of what I really needed to talk about, can really help you focus and clarify what it is that you should have been saying. That kind of practice really does help in situations where it really does matter that you have to demonstrate your knowledge very quickly. Essay exams are not a favorite of mine. I could do this a lot easier if I were just assigning a traditional essay. It would make a lot more sense to me, actually, for collecting papers and all the rest. But I give the essay exam because it oftentimes works easier for my students, or maybe not easier, but better. You'll have a discrete period of time. That means a limited period of time that you'll get to work. You have to show your knowledge. And so over the next couple of weeks, try to, as I said before, do more than the least that you can do in applying these concepts and trying to make sense of them. When you have questions, seek me out. I'd be glad to help. But the point is that you're picking things up all the time and not depending on looking it up in the book on the day of an exam. That's the way to be successful in this exam and in this class, of course, and more oftentimes in life. It's a steady approach and not the last second studying that will really help you.